Richard Vogt had never designed a flying boat before. What he came up with looked like nothing else on the water. It first took to the air in the summer of 1937, and it soon picked up the nickname Der Fliegende Holzschuh, German for the Flying Clog, simply because the hull looked like a wooden shoe. Officially, it was the Siedrache, the Sea Dragon, though almost nobody ever called it that. Hamburger Flugzeugbau already knew seaplanes inside out, so when the requirement for a new long-range maritime patrol aircraft went out over the winter of 1933-34, Vogt's team dove straight in. Vogt looked hard at what the rest of the world was building, then put 3 designs in front of the Technisches Amt, the technical office of the Reich Air Ministry, the RLM. Each one was built around his trademark tubular spar, a single steel tube that carried the loads and held the fuel. P-8 had a short hull and a twin boom tail, and its gull wing spanned 82 feet with 2 BMW-15 engines hung on it. P-12 used a conventional hull, an 89-foot span, and 3 Jumo 205 diesels. P-13 put that same wing on a twin hull layout with 4 Jumo 205s. None of them was quite what the technical office wanted, but P-8 looked the most promising. Vogt scaled the design up to match P-12, and in the spring of 1934, the contract for the Ha-138 flying boat came through. Then, with detailed design work already underway, word arrived that the BMW-15 had been canceled. Vogt proposed fitting the first prototype with 2 Jumo 206 diesels, the second with 3 Jumo 205s, and the third with 2 DB600s. A full-scale mock-up of the first prototype was finished in March 1935. Inspections and small changes followed, and preparations for production began, though the prototypes themselves crawled along because the program sat low on the priority list. In the fall of 1936, with the first airframe nearly assembled, Vogt learned that the Jumo 206 had been scrapped as well. Nothing of comparable power was available, so Hamburger Flugzeugbau had to hastily redesign the aircraft around 3 Jumo 205s. That pushed the project out to July 1937, a full 27 months from the start of development. By then, the second airframe was nearly finished too. Designed from the outset for 3 Jumo 205s, it had a straight wing instead of a gull wing. The first prototype, the Ha-138 V1, made its maiden flight on July 15, 1937. 4 weeks later, the second, V2, followed. Flight testing turned up trouble at once. The short hull behaved badly in the water, and the moment the aircraft came unstuck, it wanted to fall out of the sky. Enlarging the tail on V2 took the worst of that out, and on November 6, 1937, the aircraft went to Travemünde, the Luftwaffe's seaplane test establishment for official trials. They ran the sea trials on the Baltic in every kind of weather they could find. In the spring of 1938, Hamburger Flugzeugbau got the report back. The hull was simply the wrong shape. It wasn't strong enough to take off fully loaded in a rough sea, the tail booms shook badly, and the cockpit was miserable to sit in on a long flight. The test staff recommended starting over. Work on the third prototype had already stopped while everyone waited on Travemünde. In the end, it was scrapped, and the engineers set about a redesign so thorough that hardly anything of the original aircraft survived it. The wing became all metal, built on a 3-section tubular main spar with a metal-skinned leading edge and fabric over the rest. The center section bolted straight onto the hull and carried the engines and the tail booms. 3 flexible fuel bladders sat inside the tube. All metal wingtip floats hung under the outer wings on their own struts. The hull was all metal too, a V bottom with a single step and flared sides to throw the spray down, and it was split into 10 watertight compartments, so holing one wouldn't sink it. It barely resembled its predecessor. Its length grew from 40 feet to 50, and the step moved forward. In place of the old tubular tail booms came rectangular, all-metal stressed skin booms ending in vertical fins. All the control surfaces were fabric-covered and aerodynamically balanced. Power came from 3 Jumo 205C4 diesels, 1 on a pylon above the hull, and 2 more in nacelles on the wing leading edge, fared straight back into the tail booms. They drove 3 bladed variable pitch propellers. The crew was normally 5, with dual controls in the cockpit. The center section held a radio compartment, a small galley, and 3 bunks. 3 gun positions gave excellent fields of fire. A hydraulically powered LB-204 turret with a 20mm MG-204 cannon sat in the nose. 2 more positions were behind the wing, one at the end of the central engine nacelle and one in the tail of the hull, the first covering the rear upper quarter and the second the lower. Each carried a 7.92mm MG-15, the upper one on an Arado mount, the lower one on a D-30 mount. Bomb racks under the starboard wing took 3 50-kilo bombs. The first updated aircraft, the Bf-138A-01, took to the air in February 1939. By then, Hamburger Flugzeugbau had changed its name to Abteilung Flugzeugbau der Schiffswerft Blohm Voss, the aircraft division of the Blohm Voss shipyard. This time the trials went well, a complete reversal from the first round. At Wenzendorf, 6 pre-production Bv-138A0s were already on the stocks, and the RLM soon ordered 25 production A1s. Testing of those 6 A0s confirmed the changes had worked, though the hull still wasn't strong enough for open sea work. One airframe, Bv-138A04, went to the new plant at Finkenwerder for extra reinforcement. The rework went so deep that they gave the aircraft a new designation, Bv-138B0. Same equipment, same everything else, but its normal takeoff weight went from about 30,000 pounds to just under 32,000. The Luftwaffe ordered 10 pre-production B-0s at once, and the technical office directed that 3 of the A-0s already built be brought up to the new standard. But the Küstenfliegergruppen, the coastal aviation groups, needed flying boats badly enough that the RLM stuck with its 25 A-1s in the original configuration rather than wait, so A-1 production ran alongside the modified B-0. Testing of the first A-1 dragged into April 1940 because they were waiting for the ice on the Elbe to break up, and that was exactly when the invasion of Denmark and Norway kicked off. Desperately short of maritime aircraft, Luftwaffe Command pulled the first 2 A-1s straight off the Finkenwerder factory floor after the quickest of acceptance checks and handed them to a special transport wing with a very German name, Kampfgeschwader, zur besonderen Verwendung 108C. That unpacks to bomber wing for special duties, which in practice meant a transport outfit, and the C on the end meant seaplanes. Its squadrons flew out of Norderney, and the new aircraft went straight onto supply runs into coastal ports like Stavanger, Andalsnes, Trondheim, and Bodo. The A-1s were later ferried from Hamburg to Travemünde for acceptance testing. By June 1940, the first squadron of Küstenfliegergruppe 506, based at Hornum, had 10 of them and had them flying patrols inside a month. Combat operations turned up a long list of problems. The Jumo 205C4 diesels needed specially trained mechanics, and the nose turret's MG204 was a nightmare all on its own. Rheinmetall Borsig had developed the gun to replace the Oerlikon-derived MGFF, but it was designed for fixed ground mountings, and inside a cramped aircraft turret, every one of its teething troubles was magnified. The mechanism was so unreliable that Blohm Voss had to rush technicians to Hornum to keep it working. The constant trouble in the nose eventually killed off both the MG204 gun and the LB204 turret. Even so, the first squadron of Küstenfliegergruppe 506 deployed to the Bay of Biscay in October 1940. By the end of the year, the second squadron of Küstenfliegergruppe 906 had joined it, also on A-1s. Serviceability in both units was dismal. Engines and propellers kept failing, and on most mornings only a handful were flyable. As the weather worsened late in the year, it became clear the hull still wasn't sturdy enough for the rough water of the Bay of Biscay. The center Jumo 205C4 was the worst of the 3, repeatedly losing power on takeoff as its exhaust ports clogged, and they had to cut the flying right back. Meanwhile, Travemünde was reporting that the reinforced B-0 had most of these problems licked, but it now weighed more, so production B-1s needed the more powerful Jumo 205D. They fixed the nose gun problem at the same time. When one of the early prototypes was converted to B-0 standard, the LB204 turret gave way to a metal fairing, shaped so that a new turret with a 20mm MG 15120 could go in later. The first production boat rolled off the line at Finkenwerder in December 1940, and 14 were assembled by year's end. A hard winter and heavy ice on the Elbe then held up delivery for operational evaluation until March 1941. That's when the first 7 BV-138B1s were handed over to the Luftwaffe, along with 7 of the next variant, the BV-138C1, which had already pushed the B-series off the production line. Besides its reinforced airframe, the B-1 got Jumo 205D diesels making 880 horsepower on takeoff, and it hit a lot harder. A 20mm MG 150-120 went into both the nose turret and the rear hull position, with an MG-15 mounted directly behind the central engine. The bomb load stayed the same at first, but a factory upgrade before delivery allowed up to 6 50-kilo bombs, the standard SC-50, about 110 pounds each, or 3 150-kilo depth charges for anti-submarine work. That version was the BV-138B1U1, the U standing for Umrust Bausatz, a factory conversion set. The next version, the BV-138C1, had a stronger hull again, which pushed the weight up further. Extra air intakes appeared on top of the central engine nacelle, and the elderly MG-15 gave way to the harder-hitting 13mm MG-131. 4-bladed props replaced the 3-bladers, and earlier B-1s got them too as they came through overhaul. The radio operator picked up an MG-15 of his own, fired through a window on the starboard side of the hull. The C-1U1 carried the same expanded bomb racks as its predecessor. Getting those improved boats out of the factories, though, was a problem all its own. Despite how badly they were needed, the numbers began to drop sharply. The Luftwaffe took 15 new C-1s in April 1941, 11 the following month, and just 5 in June. The problem was parts. There simply weren't enough of them, from weapons and specialized tooling to engines, propellers, and radios. To break the bottleneck, a second line was set up at the Weser Flugzeugbau plant. But the workers there barely finished one flying boat by year's end, and even that from parts shipped in from Finkenwerder. Full production at the Weser plant didn't really get going until April 1942. 59 C-1s came off that line before it shut down in September 1943. For scale, across all plants, 1941 alone had produced 79. Another 30 were assembled at Finkenwerder before the program closed for good in December 1943. 227 C models in all, the bulk of the roughly 300 BV-138s ever built. Not every one of those airframes went to sea as a reconnaissance aircraft. One of the strangest jobs the BV-138 was ever given had nothing to do with hunting convoys, and everything to do with the water Germany itself depended on. The sea lanes were a lifeline, feeding the war economy with raw materials, food, and everything else. And once full-scale fighting broke out, the Allies could quickly block key routes in the North Sea and the Baltic and choke off the ports Germany couldn't do without. Shallow water and a flat seabed along the German coast squeezed large warships and transports into a few narrow channels, which made them sitting ducks for mines the Allies could lay at the choke points by aircraft, surface ship, or submarine. Along the German coast, the main threat was the magnetic mine. These reacted to the slightest change in a magnetic field. As a ship's steel hull passed nearby, it distorted that field, tripped the detonator, and set off a devastating explosion. There was no mooring cable to cut and nothing on the surface to see, which is exactly what made them so hard to sweep the ordinary way. The weapons had a weak spot, though. They didn't only go off under ships, an aircraft could set them off too, flying low over the water but just high enough to survive the blast. Fitted with a big magnetic ring, which the Germans called a Minenraumgerät, or trailing a cable loop known as a Minensprengschleife, the aircraft threw out a strong electromagnetic field on each low pass and detonated the mines below. Its speed usually carried it clear before the rising column of water could do any damage. To clear those minefields, the Luftwaffe put a mixed bag of aircraft to work, among them the U-52 3M, the Do-23, the Heinkel 111, and the BV-138. Another was the Ha-139, a 4-engine transatlantic mailplane pressed into service with a magnetic loop strung between its nose, its wingtips, and its tail. In the fall of 1942, Blohm Voss converted one of its BV-138s into a dedicated airborne minesweeper and sent it to Travemünde for testing. Between 1942 and 1943, a small number of BV-138Cs followed it through the same conversion, emerging as the BV-138MS. Crews called them Mousy, and set them to work clearing magnetic mines out of rivers, canals, and coastal shallows. Installing that ring added a lot of weight, so the aircraft was stripped of everything that wasn't essential to minesweeping. Out came both HDL-151 turrets, 540 pounds each. Out came the bomb shackles and 3 spare ammunition boxes and the internal oil and fuel tanks, another 400 pounds between them. Out came the standard auxiliary power unit as well, and something far bigger went in to replace it. Of all its guns, one 13mm MG-131 stayed in the rear of the center engine nacelle. An aircraft built to fight off fighters now went out over mined water with a single machine gun and a hoop of wire. The mine detonating gear more than made up the difference. The ring alone ran about a ton, and the rest went on holding it there, trusses in the outer wings, struts, brackets, spar and hull mountings, tail fittings, and a web of bracing wire. All in, the minesweeping kit put well over 1.25 tons back on the airframe. The ring was about 46 feet across, wider than the wingspan of a Bf-109. Picture a hoop of wound cable that size slung under the aircraft on mountings at the nose, the wingtips, and the tail. It hung low and slightly aft of the spar, and the whole aircraft could feel it, sluggish in roll and heavy on the controls. The generator set that drove the ring went in low and off to one side, and the weight and balance sums had to be redone from scratch. That unit, essentially an auxiliary engine and a generator, weighed a good 1.25 tons on its own, and its load was carried across 10 hull frames so that no single one took all of it. The ring and its bulky mounts put heavy stress into the hull, so they had to run heavier stiffeners down the sides. Gross takeoff weight for the BV-138MS came out at about 35,000 pounds, with the ring, the detonation gear, and a full 450 gallons of fuel aboard. At 80% cruise power, each of the 3 engines put out 640 horsepower, and it burned a bit over 100 gallons an hour. At a cruise of 124 miles an hour, that gave 5.5 hours in the air. Converting BV-138s into minesweepers, alongside similar work on U-52s, called for 10 magnetic rings a month. While Blohm Voss geared up for full production, a plant at Stendal handled the manufacturing in the meantime. Junkers was told to draft the drawings for a machine to wind the wire onto the rings, a job it put at around 10,000 man-hours. The plan called for 4 BV-138s and 6 U-52s converted every month, with Heinkel 111s also under consideration for minesweeping. A few things about the installation were unusual. Period photographs clearly show the ring's mounting points at the nose and tail of the hull and under the wings. The auxiliary power unit and generator inside the hull fed the ring its power, and Junkers wrote the manuals. In the rear, nacelle gun position, crews installed a voltmeter, an ammeter, an emergency cutout, a regulator for the field strength with its own switch, and a neon indicator light. A second kill switch for the ring sat right beside the pilot's seat. The generator compartment got a panel of switches and gauges so the crew could watch it work. The power unit had its own 32-gallon fuel tank, good for 4 hours. Junkers supplied the lubrication system, and the cooling radiator was specified by the RLM. The Minesweeper was the most radical conversion the airframe ever got, but it wasn't the only strange job it took on. Other BV-138Cs carried Fug 200 Hohenfeld search radar to find Allied convoys and Vector U-boats onto them, and at a pinch they could lift 10 fully equipped troops. Every B and C could carry rocket-assisted takeoff units, Starthilfe the Germans called it, good for about 1,100 pounds of extra thrust off the water. 70 of the Cs also got fittings for catapult launches from seaplane tenders like the Schwabenland, Bussard, Falk, Ostmark, Sperber, and Westphalen. With heavy-duty catapults and cranes, those ships worked as mobile floating bases in harsh polar waters far from any airfield ashore. Once the teething problems were behind it, the BV-138 turned out to be an exceptionally effective patrol aircraft, rugged enough to absorb heavy damage from enemy fire and from the sea itself. Its seaworthiness and its ability to stay out for days on end made a peculiar tactic possible. BV-138s would fly deep into the Atlantic, set down on the water, and drift there for 2 or 3 days waiting for word of a passing Allied convoy. Once a position came through, they'd get airborne and go after the merchantmen, working hand in glove with the U-boats. Vogt's team had built the thing to look after itself, and crews could carry out surprisingly complex repairs on the open sea, changing parts on an engine with the boat rolling under them, hundreds of miles from anyone who could help. The BV-138 could hit back hard, too. 3 gun positions gave wide arcs of fire, and the reach of those 20mm guns meant a fighter had to work for it. Normally 5 men, 6 when the mission called for it. With maximum fuel, a C-1 could stay airborne an impressive 18 hours, against roughly 6.5 on a standard load. At a normal takeoff weight of around 32,000 pounds on calm water, it needed 30 seconds and about 2,300 feet to get off. It unstuck around 67 miles an hour and came back on at about 70. And it spent almost its entire life down low, rarely more than a few thousand feet up, because that was the only height from which a crew could pick a ship out of the swell. For all that, the RLM had never meant the BV-138 to serve as long as it did. In the spring of 1940, the technical office decided it needed more long-range reconnaissance aircraft and went looking for a replacement, and Blohm Voss won the development contract. The plan called for a scaled-up BV-138 with a takeoff weight around 53,000 pounds, remote-controlled gun turrets, up to 5,700 pounds of bombs, and room inside for 60 fully equipped troops. Designers put up 8 proposals, every one of them built around Jumo 208 diesels making 1,100 horsepower at takeoff. Twin-engine and tri-motor layouts, asymmetric designs, twin hulls, even retractable landing gear. None of it ever left the drawing board because the Jumo 208 never got off the test stand. So the BV-138 stayed Germany's standard long-range patrol flying boat right to the end. That long career began badly. The raw, early A-1s saw only limited service with the coastal groups in the Bay of Biscay, and in the spring of 1941, those units were pulled out of France to re-equip with the improved B and C models. Once the Elbe thawed and the delayed deliveries started moving, things picked up quickly. By summer, the B-1 was patrolling northern waters, operating out of Stavanger, Tromsø, Banak, and Trondheim, and hunting Allied convoys alongside seaplanes like the R-196 and the Heinkel 115. Through October 1941, a single unit of just 10 B-1s logged over 500 flight hours on long-range reconnaissance, crisscrossing tens of thousands of miles of open ocean. Not bad for a design that had spent 3 years falling over. They could hold their own in a fight, too. Not long after their debut in the Norwegian campaign, BV-138 crews shot down a Blenheim over the Skagerrak. A Catalina followed over the North Sea once that type had reached RAF Coastal Command the following year. BV-138s saw heavy action over the Baltic, the North Atlantic, and the far north. Once the German High Command worked out how much damage the Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk were doing, the seaplane bases in Norway became a top priority. The turning point in hunting those convoys came in the summer of 1942, when 44 BV-138s were massed in northern Norway. They proved exceptionally good at finding enemy transports and shadowing them relentlessly, and for a while they took almost no losses. Then, on September 8, 1942, the tide began to turn. That day, a BV-138 out of Tromsø spotted convoy PQ-18 near Jan Mayen Island, and German reconnaissance aircraft started tracking it at once. The very next day, the British escort carrier HMS Avenger joined the convoy's screen with 12 Sea Hurricanes aboard, 6 spotted on deck, ready to fly, and 6 struck down below as replacements. For the first time, an Arctic convoy had its own air cover. The big, slow BV-138s found it desperately hard to hold contact. In one engagement, a German boat fought a grueling 90-minute battle against British fighters and limped home, shot to pieces. All through 1942, BV-138s out of Norway met U-boats in the open sea. Refueling from a submarine stretched their range enormously and let them sit on the Soviet convoy routes for days at a time, a practice they kept up until August 1943. By then, they were flying from improvised anchorages deep inside Soviet waters, places the Germans never occupied so much as visited. As part of the push into the Kara Sea, Operation Wonderland, 2 U-boats set up a forward refueling and supply point in the Novaya Zemlya archipelago. Working out of that hidden anchorage for weeks, the flying boats flew 8 long-range reconnaissance missions east, reaching as far as the Yamal Peninsula and the northern Urals. What they were hunting for was the Soviet traffic that ran through the Kara Sea in the few weeks the ice allowed, and the icebreakers that led it. The Arctic wasn't the only far corner they ended up in. In late 1941, a German unit flying outdated R-95 biplanes converted to the BV-138 and was soon sent to the Romanian port of Constanta on the Black Sea. Constanta put them within reach of most of the western Black Sea, and for the next 2 years, these big 3-engine boats were the backbone of German maritime reconnaissance there, often flying under Romanian fighter escort. They shot photo reconnaissance, shadowed Soviet shipping, and bombed anything that moved until late summer 1944, when the Black Sea operation folded up for good. In 1943, BV-138s turned up once again over the Bay of Biscay and the Mediterranean. That spring, the Germans sent a flying boat detachment to the Biscay coast with 7 BV-138s and 1 massive BV-222. Over the next month, as a few more 222s arrived, the detachment came under relentless attack from British fighter bombers. The boats took a beating right at their moorings, several sunk where they lay, and most of the rest heavily damaged, leaving 2 BV-138s and 2 BV-222s serviceable. Through constant reorganizations and heavy losses, the rebuilt unit, down to a handful of 138s and a few pre-production 222s, kept flying over the Atlantic and the Bay of Biscay until the Germans were forced out of their base at Biscarrosse in 1944. In the Mediterranean, Seeaufklärungsgruppe 126 set up shop on Crete in the spring of 1943, one of the few units flying nothing but BV-138s. It later moved east, working the northern and central sectors of the Eastern Front, and in the last stretch of the war, it flew maritime patrol out of Denmark. By May 1944, the number of serviceable BV-138s was falling fast. Taking a slow, heavy boat up under total Allied air supremacy was close to suicide. Even so, the cold northern water remained a last refuge for them. A couple of reconnaissance groups hanging on at Norwegian seaplane bases kept about 2 dozen flyable, sometimes pairing them with lighter R-196 floatplanes. A few of the BV-138 MS Minesweepers served with Minesweeper 1. As of January 10, 1945, according to the Luftwaffe's own strength returns, BV-138s were operational only with Seeaufklärungsgruppe 126 and Seeaufklärungsgruppe 130, both under Luftflotte 5. By April 9, 1945, 126 was the only unit still carrying the type on strength. Even when the paperwork no longer showed BV-138s anywhere else, these boats were still being flown operationally. A striking example came on May 1, 1945. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Klemusch of Seeaufklärungsgruppe 130, based in Copenhagen, was handed an order he can't have believed. He was to fly his BV-138 into a burning Berlin at night, put it down on the Havel, and pick up 2 men. By that point, the city was ringed by Soviet artillery, and that stretch of water was about the only place left inside German lines big enough to land on. Despite heavy artillery fire, Klemusch got it down on the water anyway. But the 2 men couldn't produce any documents to say who they were, and he flatly refused to take them aboard. Instead, he loaded 10 wounded soldiers into the cabin and flew them back to Copenhagen. The story goes that the men he turned away were carrying Hitler's last will and testament out of Berlin.